Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, after a brief pause, the briefest of pauses, to discuss the Rings of Power and the concerns of the Second Age of Middle-earth in last week's show, which was so much fun, and a very quick thank you, in fact, right at the top of the show, to everyone who has emailed me, has sent me correspondence over the course of the last week. It has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you all about the Rings of Power. It's been fascinating conversations. There will be a follow-up show, probably sooner than I anticipated, but not terribly soon. More on that in just a moment. This week, though, setting aside the Rings of Power and Amazon's contribution to Tolkienian lore, we return to the end of the Third Age, the story of the quest of Erebor as recorded by Bilbo Baggins, the eponymous Hobbit. Tonight, we are going to fish ourselves out of the river, dry ourselves off, restore ourselves with a brief fortnight spent on the shores of the Long Lake, and then begin the next leg of the adventure in what is the culmination of the turning point that I have been presaging over the course of the last few weeks. I've been pointing to this turning point and the beginning of this second significant chunk of composition, right? The post-long break, post-Elven Kingdom, post-Barrels Out of Bond part of the story that Tolkien is now ready to begin, ready to enact, ready to carry us through. It's a really fascinating turn in the text, turn in the tone, certainly. And we are offered some surprisingly provocative and frictional perspectives on life in Middle-earth, particularly this part of Middle-earth east of the Misty Mountains. Before we get to all of that, though, a brief scheduling announcement, because as you may have noticed, I'm running a little late with the Sunday show for this week. I have a good reason, I can assure you. In fact, I have two good reasons, which were entirely self-inflicted. The kind of work that I do here is a strange thing because sometimes, not often, because I've been doing this for a long time, but sometimes I can undertake a piece of research that is just simply far more vast, wide, deep, complex than I expected it to be. I should have known better in this particular instance, I will say that. But I spent the week preparing a script, preparing my notes that just refused to come together, refused to reach a state of completion such that I could record it and put that show. I don't know why I'm being coy. I was talking about Tom Bombadil, right? I undertook the Tom Bombadil episode with very important capital letters and just ran out of time to prep it, not least of all because now I guess I have to watch the second season of Rings of Power in order to offer a commentary on that, as well as reading a lot of supplementary text. So that show is coming rather brilliantly, if I say so myself. I did realize that I was going to run late with the Tom Bombadil episode and decided to kick it down the road to like next week and undertake something much simpler, much more straightforward. The countercultural episode, talking about the phenomenon that is the Lord of the Rings in the 1960s, the way that it both is shaped by in the popular consciousness and in turn shapes, in terms of the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, the entire political dynamic of that very important and significant decade. So I undertook too big a task, set it aside, and undertook too big a task. I think I'm going to do something on the texts, on the textual history. Maybe that will come out in the next couple of days. So I do apologize for that being late, but I promise that, the next 3 episodes are going to absolutely make up for it because there's a lot of really fascinating conversations waiting for us on all of those topics. Good evening to Brian. Good evening to Andrea. Thank you so much for joining me live. A quick note here too for the two of you, I guess, and anyone else who happens to be joining in live tonight. I will be hosting Last Call at the Green Dragon immediately after we conclude tonight's proceedings. That show has been jumping around a little bit in the schedule. It's really nice to be able to situate it back. Again, if you're listening to the podcast after the fact, dear listener, then you should know that Last Call at the Green Dragon is a patron-exclusive after show where I'm going to hang out and talk some more about Lake Town, probably talk maybe a little bit about the position of men, specifically, of human beings in the text of The Hobbit, and particularly as we're introduced to them right here in chapter 10 of The Hobbit. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, but for all that, a fairly brief one. I forget always when I'm reading the book how short this chapter is, and we spend fully, 15% of it, maybe 20% of it, kind of just dealing with the end of Barrels Out of Bond, and then it's a very swift progression to the next phase. Andrea's saying it's really fun in the Green Dragon. Thank you, Andrea. I have a lot of fun there too. Let's get into our discussion then for tonight and pick up with the dwarves and the barrels drifting down the river running to the Long Lake, concluding the last part of our previous adventure, and we'll begin with tonight's first slide. The day grew lighter and warmer as they floated along. After a while, the river rounded a steep shoulder of land that came down upon their left. Under its rocky feet, like an inland cliff, the deepest stream had flowed, lapping and bubbling. Suddenly the cliff fell away, the shores sank, the trees ended. Then Bilbo saw a sight. The lands opened wide about him, filled with the waters of the river, which broke up and wandered in 100 winding courses, or halted in marshes and pools dotted with isles on every side, but still a strong water flowed unsteadily through the midst. And far away, its dark head in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. Its nearest neighbours to the northeast and the tumbled land that joined it to them could not be seen. All alone it rose and looked across the marshes to the forest. The lonely mountain. Bilbo had come far and through many adventures to see it, and now he did not like the look of it in the least. As he listened to the talk of the raftmen and pieced together the scraps of information they'd let fall, he soon realized that he was very fortunate ever to have seen it at all, even from this distance. Dreary as had been his imprisonment and unpleasant as was his position, to say nothing of the poor dwarves underneath him, still he had been more lucky than he had guessed. I mentioned, I think, in the last episode, talking about the text of The Hobbit, that the largest part of Bilbo's luck is referred to during Flies and Spiders, during Barrels Out of Bond, and then when he actually meets Smaug. Apart from that, we get references here and there to Bilbo's luck, but those are the concentrated lucky chapters. Those are the periods in Bilbo's adventure wherein he is most blessed with his unusual, striking, surprising, and, as the narrator insists on emphasizing, very deliberate kind of luck. What's interesting about this, well, there are two parts that are interesting about this. One we will pick up in just a moment with the idea that had there been another means of getting to Lake Town, or let me rephrase that entirely, I suppose. Had Bilbo not been disrupted from his path at any previous point along his journey, he would not now be about to reach Lake Town, because every other avenue has been blocked, has become corrupted, has fallen into darkness like the Mirkwood, or has fallen into misuse right here with the marshes here. Brian's asking in the chat, I wonder how the barrels could be sealed tightly enough that they didn't flood without suffocating the dwarves. And Andrea says, I have wondered the same thing. And those are excellent, excellent questions. We don't really know, right? I've never been completely satisfied. If I'm being utterly candid here, I've never been completely satisfied with the barrels. I've never really loved the escape from Thranduil's halls, particularly given the tonal shift that we are about to see, right? Literally in tonight's reading, I mentioned last week, or in our last reading, that we had transitioned now. We were at the foothills of a proper fantasy novel, that we were kind of leaving fairy tale behind. And the barrels are the last fairy tale element. The barrels are the last kind of implausible, kind of, or at least difficult to reckon with explanation. Now, I myself have kind of written some fanfic around the edges of this particular sequence in order to understand it better, in order to kind of justify it, which is to say that many of the barrels are empty, which means that presumably they are more buoyant, right? So these barrels are lashed together into the large raft that the raft elves are negotiating down the river. So it is possible that perhaps the dwarven barrels are not completely, mark you, sealed. So maybe there's enough of an airflow. Maybe there's just enough, a small hole here or there would be enough to permit the passage of air, but perhaps not the passage of the cold waters of the river running. I don't have, I'm afraid, a satisfying explanation. I will argue perhaps that this is one of those moments, few fleeting moments, in which Peter Jackson's lack of concern about geography and time, right? The way that time and space both collapse in the Jackson films, this is perhaps one of the spaces in which that is actually effective, that is actually contributory to the story itself, that it becomes easier to reconcile the Barrels Out of Bond sequence if it takes 45 minutes and not to say anything good about that extended action sequence, of course, but the fact that they are in the barrels for over a day, although I will say I do love how desperate and wretched the dwarves are when we pull them out, though we will, of course, get to that in just a moment. So, to circle back, again, we see very conspicuously here, the narrator calling out again Bilbo's luck, kind of sealing up the end of the Elven Realm adventure, if you like, with another reference to his luck and his final arrival here in Lake Town. And this is the point at which we're basically going to sideline Bilbo. In fact, we've already begun to sideline Bilbo right here in the narrative. In fact, if I can call up the slide again, I can demonstrate. I can illustrate that point by referencing to the middle of this second paragraph here. And far away, its dark head, in a torn cloud, there loomed the mountain. Its nearest neighbors to the northeast and the tumbled land that joined it to them could not be seen. Here we are in this moment where the text itself, this procession of short sentences that we get in the first paragraph, suddenly the cliff fell away, period. The shores sank, period. The trees ended, period. Then Bilbo saw a sight, colon, right? Introducing us to what it is that Bilbo beholds, and then almost immediately transitioning out of Bilbo's direct vision to geographical detail about the lonely mountain, to account, it would seem, for the loneliness of the mountain. Well, the mountain isn't lonely, right? There's not just a single solitary peak. That would be crazy. And I, J.R.R. Tolkien, am nothing but fastidious in my application of current geological knowledge, right? There is something happening here, which is both, I think, narrative and a gesture toward a broader kind of world building, which is appropriate because we're going to spend a lot of time building out the world through this sequence. So, Bilbo is feeling wretched. That is going to be a feature of the rest of this chapter, comedically in part, but also as a useful counterpoint that physically sets Bilbo apart from the rest of the company, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Let's get into Lake Town here, and we'll see what we make of it. If I can persuade this slide to transition. There we are. Not far from the mouth of the forest river was the strange town he heard the elves speak of in the king's cellars. It was not built on the shore, though there were a few huts and buildings there, but right out on the surface of the lake, protected from the swirl of the entering river by a promontory of rock which formed a calm bay. A great bridge made of wood ran out to where on huge piles made of forest trees was built a busy wooden town, not a town of elves, but of men, who still dared to dwell here under the shadow of the distant Dragon Mountain. They still throve on the trade that came up through the great river from the south and carted past the falls to their town. But in the great days of old, when Dale in the north was rich and prosperous, they had been wealthy and powerful, and there had been fleets of boats on the waters, and some were filled with gold and some with warriors and armor, and there had been wars and deeds which were now only a legend. The rotting piles of a greater town could still be seen along the shores when the waters sank in a drought. But men remembered little of all that, though some still sang old songs of the dwarf kings of the mountain, Thror and Thrain of the race of Durin, and the coming of the dragon and the fall of the lords of Dale. Some sang too that Thror and Thrain would come back one day, and gold would flow in rivers through the mountain gates, and all that land would be filled with new song and new laughter. But this pleasant legend did not much affect their daily business. So we're positioning very carefully this idea of Lake Town within its geography and also within its history. This is Lake Town 2. This is, the second Lake Town that has been built here. We can see the pillars, the remnants of the older version of the town, about which we know nothing. We don't know. I mean, by implication, from the context of this passage, we can maybe speculate that this was the version of Lake Town of Esgaroth, a name that Tolkien includes on the map in The Hobbit, but never arrives at a satisfactory gloss, or late in his career, very late in his career, he will try to come to a satisfactory gloss of the meaning of Esgaroth, but it is one of these words that just appears. It is one of these words that just seems to fit and manages to stick around through many, many revisions. So we have the idea of a lake town that existed here when Dale, a state that is now being introduced to us for the first time, right? When Dale was great and at its height, when Erebor was at its height, this was a bustling trading town that we can speculate was perhaps then destroyed by Smaug himself, by the dragon, in the devastation of fire. And what's interesting here, and what I think is often misconstrued, is the idea that this is a city that exists upon the waters of the lake because Tolkien is imitating prehistoric lake towns found in primarily Switzerland, where, of course, Tolkien traveled when he was young, built on the water for defense and security, which is a fantastic mode of defense and security if you're thinking about other Neolithic clans, other tribes nearby, and you're not thinking about a fire-breathing dragon. I want to show you, in fact, let me call this up, the image that Tolkien gives us of Lake Town, famously, a really beautiful image. Tolkien was not terribly taken with his own skill as a draftsman, and certainly we might speculate that there are some perspective issues happening in this picture which don't completely hold together, but it's still, I think, a very evocative image. And you can see here the intent of Lake Town. There is an idea oftentimes in kind of popular Tolkien fandom that Lake Town is built on the lake as a defense against Smaug. It is a response to the incursion of Smaug to the Lonely Mountain, which just, as we can see from this reference to previous pillars, just isn't true, right? It is, as we will see, a very poor defense, in fact, against a gigantic fire-breathing monster. This is, as I say, kind of imitating these Neolithic pile houses built in Switzerland. I wanted to call up, in fact, I pulled a picture from the Wiki Commons. Here, this is a real Neolithic pile house on the Bodensee. This is Lake Constance, as it's called in English, on the border between Germany and Switzerland and Austria. This is a reconstruction of a Paleolithic community that, as I say, built this town out on these gigantic piles because they were easy to defend. You're giving your enemies, you're giving wild animals, you're giving whatever, marauders you have to consider a single point of access to your entire town. It is extremely defensible. So this is what Tolkien is drawing on, and it's fascinating to see him draw on this so thoroughly, so comprehensively. This is a very rare example of Tolkien kind of anchoring with an enormous real-world specificity one of his fictional locations. The Shire is evocative of Middle England, right? Rivendell is evocative of Faerie, for sure. Lothlorien even more so. The only other place that I think, and Gondor, of course, is drenched in like a Arthurian chivalry. It's absolutely reeking of that kind of, particular high medieval sense of nobility. The only other place that I can think of in the Legendarium that is as directly historically anchored is Edoras, is the appropriately, coincidentally similarly named Edoras, the home of the Rohirrim, because that is very representative of an Anglo-Saxon community, right? Obviously, when we get Methuseld, we are deliberately and directly, I guess Beorn too, right, is also imitating that kind of Anglo-Saxon mead hall construction. But here we're getting something that is, very, very real, very direct, and very unusual. And also, I think it's fair to say, very difficult to conceptualize. I myself spent maybe the first 15 years of my Tolkien fandom not ever really having a clear idea about Lake Town, not ever really having like a mental vision of what it was that Tolkien was suggesting here. But, now that I've seen these pictures, thanks to Wikipedia, we can all, I think, have a clearer sense. And also, to a certain extent, the Peter Jackson film, the second of the Hobbit movies, The Desolation of Smaug, because while that is going in a very different direction, while we're really leaning into Victoriana there, we're really leaning into the idea of an almost a quasi-steampunk kind of environment there in Lake Town. It is at least distinctive. It is at least powerfully realized in the movie, if not completely coherent with either the content of the book or like its own internal development. But that's maybe a conversation for another time. Let's get to the rescue of the dwarves then and see how we will fare now that we are in this new town. Well, here we are, said Thorin. And I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I'm sure he has a right to expect it, though. I wish he could have arranged a more comfortable journey. Still, all very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins. No doubt we shall feel properly grateful when we are fed and recovered. In the meanwhile, what next? I suggest Lake Town, said Bilbo. What else is there? Nothing else could, of course, be suggested, so leaving the others, Thorin and Fili and Kili and the Hobbit went across the shore to the Great Bridge. There were guards at the head of it, but they were not keeping very careful watch, for it was so long since they had had any real need. Except for occasional squabbles about river tolls, they were friends with the Wood Elves. Other folk were far away, and some of the younger people in the town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain and laughed at the greybeards and gammers who said that they had seen him flying in the sky in their young days. That being so, it is not surprising that the guards were drinking and laughing by a fire in their hut and did not hear the noise of the unpacking of the dwarves or the footsteps of the 4 scouts. Their astonishment was enormous when Thorin Oakenshield stepped in through the door. "Who are you, and what do you want?" they shouted, leaping to their feet and groping for weapons. "Thorin, son of Thrain, son of Thrord, king under the mountain," said the dwarf in a loud voice, and he looked it, in spite of his torn clothes and draggled hood. The gold gleamed on his neck and waist. His eyes were dark and deep. "I have come back. I wish to see the master of your town." And this is more, we should be clear, than just a moment of intimidation, a moment of manifestation here from Thorin, because textually, in terms of the composition, this is quite literally the moment that Thorin Oakenshield becomes Thorin Oakenshield. I mentioned this all the way back, I think, at the beginning of this unit, the beginning of our discussion of The Hobbit, wherein it is, I guess, Thorin, who is called Gandalf. I was trying to come to the right strategy for approaching the tangle of names that we get at the beginning. Thorin, throughout the first phase of composition, in effect, is called Gandalf. And Gandalf is called Bloodorthin. And this is the point at which Tolkien revises that. He retroactively revises that. This is the point in the composition where he comes up with Thorin's father and grandfather, as well as his name. All of those are retroactively applied, of course. Name changes are the kind of thing that are actually very easy in an edit, but this is the moment where it seems as though Tolkien has the first clear idea of who Thorin is. And it's no coincidence that he declaims his identity twice in the span of, 2 pages, right? This is a completely different kind of Thorin than we've seen previously. Even this introductory dialogue that we get attributed to him here. And I suppose we ought to thank our stars and Mr. Baggins. I'm sure he has a right to expect it, though I wish he could have arranged a more comfortable journey. Right? Okay, kind of grumpy Thorin that we see here. Still, all very much at your service once more, Mr. Baggins, which is an interesting positioning in terms of he's acknowledging the debt that the dwarves owe Bilbo, but he's doing so with a kind of magnanimity, a kind of condescension, but it's not a real offering of service, right? Which is a very symbolic and interesting thing that we have observed in the dwarves in the past. I also want to focus here for a moment on the positioning here of Lake Town, right? Again, Bilbo completely sidelined by the narrative at this point. We're told that he is present, and that's basically it, right? He suggests Lake Town. What else is there? Which kind of detracts from the power of Bilbo's own suggestion. Well, hey, maybe we should do the one thing that we could do now. Bilbo is being sidelined out of his own narrative, and we're pulling away our focus again to look at the stories of Lake Town, to look at the economics of Lake Town, right? To consider the position of Lake Town in the world at large. Other folk were far away. Some of the younger people in the town openly doubted the existence of any dragon in the mountain, right? They're told by their grandparents, by their graybeards and gammers here, that of course there's a dragon there. We ourselves have seen it. It is in living memory that the dragon has been flying around the Lonely Mountain. But it has been so long, 170 years since Smaug took up residence, but we can speculate maybe, 60 years? Maybe 70 at a push being the lifespan of the men and women of Lake Town here. It has been that long almost since Smaug has been visible in the skies over the Lonely Mountain. And that has led to a kind of comfort. It's interesting to think about Lake Town as being so challenged, right? So insecure, such a stressful environment. Here we are living this precarious existence above the long lake at the mouth of the river running with this uneasy, certainly, mutually advantageous, but still a strange relationship with the elves and the specter of Smaug right there amidst the ruin of Erebor and Dale and, the Esgaroth that was. But that's not what we see. That's not what the text tells us, right? We're inferring all of that. We're kind of pulling in our own understanding of the geopolitics of this realm, of all Middle Earth, and in fact, at this point in the Third Age. But actually, Lake Town is quiet and fairly prosperous, and certainly peaceful, which forces us to reappraise our sense of the master when we get to him. We're going to talk a little more about him. I think in the actual last slide that I have pulled tonight, we'll get the opportunity to really talk about the master. So we have the rescue of the dwarves, all of whom survive sodden and ruined and very desperately unhappy. We get that great beat about Feely emerging from his apple barrel, having been tormented by the smell of apples and now never wanting to eat another apple in his life. And then we do what many adapters of this text would love to do, which is we just cut down the number of dwarves that we have to deal with. We compress it down to 3 dwarves and Bilbo, go into Lake Town in order to establish themselves, in effect, right? And we get the declamation of Thorin. And this is important, not just because it is the full realization of Thorin's identity for the first time here in the course of the book, right? Everything else has been informed, but this is him wielding the title of King Under the Mountain in a way that he has never had, well, neither cause nor opportunity, right? To kind of claim his identity in the same way. But here he is deliberately setting himself up, or the narrative is deliberately setting him up, I suppose, as a counterpoint to the Master of Lake Town, to whom we shall get in just a few slides. And I guess I'll take the opportunity right now just to drop in and say, it is fascinating as we look at the textual evolution of this story that there is no bard present in this sequence, that bard does not enter the story. There's so much of Lake Town. For as full and as realized as it is, there is so much that isn't present yet. There's so much that we won't arrive at until after we have been to the Lonely Mountain. Hugh is joining us here this evening. Good morning, Hugh. Let's move on then to the song. I suppose we go inside to feast and to talk to the Master of Lake Town and the Raft Elves, of course, who immediately point out that these dwarves are the dwarves who were imprisoned in their king's halls back in the Woodland Realm, and the Master hesitates. We get this great moment of friction here between the politic of the situation, right? The realpolitik of, here are former prisoners of my closest ally. As we just learned in the previous slide, everyone else lives a long way away, right? It's basically the elves and the men of Lake Town, and that's it in this region. So these dwarves were the prisoners of my closest ally. So the political thing to do would be perhaps to, at the very least, detain them in order to ascertain the truth, right? The Master of Lake Town, a conniving and self-serving individual, as we'll see more fully in the pages to come, would certainly, I believe, be, if not justified, then at least understood for taking such a course of action. However, politics is no match for prophecy, because the people of Lake Town greet the dwarves, greet the return of the King Under the Mountain with a song. And we're going to take a look at that here. The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone, the lord of silver fountains shall come into his own. His crown shall be upholden, his harp shall be restrung, his walls shall echo golden to songs of yore resung. The woods shall wave on mountains and grass beneath the sun, and his wealth shall flow in fountains, and the rivers golden run. The streams shall run in gladness, the lakes shall shine and burn, all sorrow fail and sadness at the mountain king's return. Now, this is not, I think, the most interesting piece of poetry that we get in the entire book. Obviously, I'm a fan of all of Tolkien's poems, but this one is lacking a certain something, except the lack of a certain something is, in fact, its greatest strength, right? Because it is a very direct and unambiguous piece, though it is possessed of a couple of really interesting qualities. It's primarily in iambic trimeter with this extra unstressed syllable in the first and third lines of the stanza of each of these 4 stanzas. So we can think of a single iamb as being an unstressed, stressed syllable, right? The king. Unstressed, stressed. The king. Then we knit 3 of those together. The king beneath the mount. And then we add that extra unstressed syllable at the end of that first line. The king beneath the mountains, the king of carven stone. You see how we end there on the stressed syllable. So this is iambic trimeter with that extra unstressed syllable on that first and third line of the stanza, and a very simple A-B rhyme scheme. Mountains, fountains, stone, own, upholden, golden, restrung, resung, right? We can see very simply how this whole thing is put together. But that is not the most interesting, or neither of those things, I should say. Neither the meter nor the rhyme scheme are the most interesting qualities of this particular poem, because what really strikes you about this poem is the passive voice. These things are going to happen, but crucially, No one is going to do them. As Brian's calling out here in the chat, the lakes shall shine and burn. Foreshadowing? I am inclined to think yes. I think that, right, let's observe the passive voice, right? The Lord of Silver Fountains shall come into his own. This is a thing that shall happen to him, right? Where we're getting the subject of the sentence is receiving the action rather than, performing it, right? No one is doing these things. These things are just happening. His crown shall be upholden. His harp shall be restrung. His halls shall echo golden to songs of yore resung. These are just going to happen. And though that is, in terms of the English language, weak stuff, right? You don't use the passive voice because it is less active. It is, as the name suggests, it is less direct. It is less evocative of feeling and action. It is simply less dynamic than using the active voice, right? He shall uphold his crown. He shall restring his harp. His people shall sing the songs of yore. And again, his hall shall echo golden, right? There is a more direct way of doing this. But what's fascinating about this, I think, is the positioning of the passive voice as the voice of prophecy, because it gives you that gorgeous, almost Greek kind of ambiguity about the prophecy. These things shall happen, but after what cause? And to what effect, right? Who is going to do these things and what is going to happen as a result of them? And Brian, I think you're calling out exactly the right point. The lakes shall shine and burn. The streams shall run in gladness. The lakes shall shine and burn. All sorrow, fail, and sadness at the mountain king's return. All sorrow, fail, and sadness. So sorrow will fail and also sadness will fail? Or all will be sorrow and failure and sadness? Right? There's an ambiguity presented to us right here through the use of the passive voice. Even that and the river's golden run, right? We'll get that too. Obviously, the people of Esgaroth here, the people of Lake Town, are taking this as proof. As they, when they welcome the dwarves, they look to the mountain and expect it to be like shining yellow. They expect the lake to be lit up with the glow of gold about it. They're expecting this tide of good fortune to emanate from the mountain. But there is this ambiguity that is present. And I love very much how that is presented here. Hugh's saying here in the chat, I've always believed that once everyone is out of the Elven King's dungeon, that there is a renewed purpose. The dwarves and Bilbo become unstoppable. Nothing can stop them to get to the mountain now. I think you're completely right, Hugh. This is one of the ways in which this is manifested, right? For the first time in the book, they get to a new place, and that new place is basically immediately on side. They are just right in line with the dwarves and what they want. They have real allies. Beorn is not really an ally in the same sense. He's roughly, rudely kind of on their side. The Eagles are roughly, rudely on their side. Elrond even, right? Kind of, yeah, okay, he's on side, but you get the sense that he's helping out because it's a personal favor to Gandalf, much more than because he really believes in the dwarves' quest, believes in the quest of Erebor. But now we've got people. Now we've got resources. Now we've got a place to stay and a place to be celebrated, which is particularly striking in terms of, again, we'll talk about the choices made in the Jackson movie, but one of the stranger elements of that, I think, is with all of the emphasis put on homecoming and belonging and having a place of one's own, the friction that is immediately present in our understanding of Lake Town, the conflict that is present in our understanding of Lake Town as it's depicted in the Desolation of Smaug, kind of detracts from the idea that the dwarves are welcome here for the first time in who even knows how long. When was the last time they were really, comfortable? When was the last time they were really safe? When was the last time they were celebrated rather than opposed? And all of that is given explanation here in what seems superficially to be a fairly thin bit of writing, but in its thinness kind of reveals these layers of ambiguity and different ways in which the poem itself can be read. We're going to see exactly how it plays out. I think we'll call back to this as we move through the back half of the story, just to really check in with this prophecy and see whether or not we can justify this explanation, right? Is this prophecy, or is this something else that's happening here? Let's move in then, as I'm already more than halfway through my time, let's move into the recovery of the dwarves. Soon afterwards, the other dwarves were brought into the town amid scenes of astonishing enthusiasm. They were all doctored and fed and housed and pampered in the most delightful and satisfactory fashion. A large house was given up to Thorin and his company. Boats and rowers were put at their service, and crowds sat outside and sang songs all day, or cheered if any dwarf showed so much as his nose. Some of the songs were old ones, But some of them were quite new and spoke confidently of the sudden death of the dragon and of cargoes of rich presents coming down the river to Laketown. These were inspired largely by the master, and they did not particularly please the dwarves, but in the meantime they were well contented, and they quickly grew fat and strong again. Indeed, within a week they were quite recovered, fitted out in fine cloth of their proper colours, with beards combed and trimmed and proud steps. Thorin looked and walked as if his kingdom was already regained, and Smaug chopped up into little pieces. Then, as he had said, the dwarves' good feeling toward the little hobbit grew stronger every day. There were no more groans or grumbles. They drank his health, and they patted him on the back, and they made a great fuss of him, which was just as well, for he was not feeling particularly cheerful. He had not forgotten the look of the mountain, nor the thought of the dragon, and he had besides a shocking cold. For 3 days he sneezed and coughed, and he could not go out, and even after that his speeches at banquets were limited to, "Thank you very much." Brian saying, Smaug stew. Yeah, chopped up into little bits is kind of excessive in terms of the slaying of the dragon. And look where we are now, right? That's a crucial element in this textual reframing, the diegetic reframing of Thorin's purpose. These dwarves set out on a treasure hunt. These dwarves hired a burglar to sneak into their mountain and recover not their home, but their treasure. That was what was important. And not even perhaps all of their treasure, just enough of it to relieve their lives of economic insecurity. But now we've transitioned into a completely different kind of story. Now we're talking about the return of the king. Now we're talking about slaying the dragon, who to this point had considered slaying the dragon. These dwarves, of course, were barely armed when they went to Bilbo's house. They had the small knives, which we now learn have been taken by the Woodland Elves. They literally show up to Laketown with one sword between them, right, with Sting as the only weapon that Bilbo still manages to somehow conceal. This is also the moment we should call out that is recalled at the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. There's nothing in The Hobbit to suggest this, but this is Bilbo's 51st birthday. It's an elegant piece of retconning when we get to the Long Expected Party. In fact, I pulled the slide just from the end of the Long Expected Party just to look at this. It is also, if I may be allowed to refer to ancient history, the anniversary of my arrival by barrel at Esgaroth on the Long Lake. Though the fact that it was my birthday slipped my memory on that occasion. I was only 51 then, and birthdays did not seem so important. The banquet was very splendid, however, though I had a bad cold at the time, I remember, and could only say, "Thank you very much." And now repeat it more correctly. "Thank you very much for coming to my little party." Obstinate silence. They all feared that a song or some poetry was now imminent, and they were getting bored. Why couldn't he stop talking and let them drink his health? But Bilbo did not sing or recite. He paused for a moment. "Thirdly and finally," he said, "I wish to make an announcement." He spoke the last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. "I regret to announce that, though as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you, this is the end. I am going. I am leaving now. Goodbye." And of course, that is the origin of the legend of old Mad Baggins, who would disappear in a flash and return with bags full of money. This is, of course, right, the event of Bilbo's 51st birthday is also, of course, Frodo's birthday, but not for a while. This is 2941 of the Third Age, 1341 in Shire reckoning, and Frodo won't be born until 2968, another 27 years in the future, which kind of brilliantly, I had never realized the symmetry of this until literally sitting down to prepare for this session, to prepare for today's class, but there is a beautiful symmetry to this. Frodo will turn 51. As Bilbo is turning 51 here as he comes into Esgaroth in the company of the dwarves, Frodo will turn 51 after the end of the War of the Ring, when they're back in Rivendell, before the travelers depart to unscour the Shire. Just like Bilbo, Frodo spends his 50th year beginning a remarkable adventure and returns in his 51st. I really like the balance there, the symmetry of that. Andrea is asking, so I don't get why they're so full of themselves considering all that's happened so far. Is it just that Thorin sees himself a king so the rest of them do too? I mean, I think to a certain degree, yes, right? I think that being hailed and praised. Okay, so there is a symbolic quality to this that we might be tempted to infer. We are now back, as we know from Bilbo's account, but this would also be true of the dwarves, right? We are now back at the Lonely Mountain. We're not at the Lonely Mountain, but we can see it. We are in familiar territory. Thorin demands to be taken to the master of Laketown, right? Not your lord, your leader, your ruler, your king, whatever, right? He doesn't fudge that at all. He knows that Esgaroth has a master, that is the formal title for the ruler of this town. More on that, by the way, later. So this is familiar to Thorin. This is home to Thorin. And we must remember, too, that very much unlike the movie, Thorin in the book is the eldest of the dwarves. He is the one with the clearest memory of Erebor before Smaug came. He is the one who remembers this place. So being back here and being hailed here, being welcomed as King Under the Mountain, the first time, maybe not the first time that he has used that title since Smaug descended on Erebor, but the first time that that title has had any weight, the first time that anyone has cared to hear it in 170 years, which is significant. I guess that title wasn't Thorin's the whole 170 years, right? But it's been his for a minute, and he's never really had the chance to use it. And now they are welcomed, and they're given this song in the passive voice. And what happens? The dwarves start thinking in the passive voice. Thorin starts thinking in the passive voice. He starts thinking about, well, you know, when the dragon is slain and the treasure is mine again and the kingdom is restored to the dwarves as it should be. He's not thinking about action. He's not thinking about strategy. Bilbo is the only one who remembers it. Bilbo is the only one who is constantly thinking, there is a dragon that we have to deal with, and we don't have so much as the beginnings of a plan, right? It is getting more impossible for Bilbo to conceive of any kind of lasting victory here as it becomes more trite and obvious and straightforward for the dwarves to believe that they have, in fact, already won, right? They've done it. They did the hard part. They made it through the Woodland Realm. They're here now at Lake Town. Everything from here is going to be completely straightforward, I'm sure. All right, Andrew's saying, so it's the power of song. Professor loves the power of song. Absolutely, he does. You're completely right. Yeah, I think so. I think there's a part of that. Power of song, yes. Power of prophecy, yes. I think we could argue that there is something else happening here, that there is something under the surface. The element here that doesn't quite fit for me, that I find so interesting, you know, if we're tempted to kind of lean into the professor's own biography, if we're interested in thinking about his position, you know, vis-a-vis the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second, it's really interesting to think about this idea that the foe has been forgotten, right? One of the reasons that the idea that the dragon can be slain is taking hold so quickly, that not the idea that the dragon can be slain, that the dragon will be slain, that the power of momentum is on their side now, is that the folk of Lake Town barely remember the dragon. It is only the very eldest who saw it with their own eyes. So the scale of the thing, the reality of the thing has receded. It's become a kind of story. And I do think that there's this interesting dualism. There's an interesting kind of push-pull here in terms of the ways in which we are empowered by stories. See all of Tolkien's work, right? Stories are incredibly important and do motivate you in terms of accomplishing the impossible, undertaking great tasks and overcoming great ordeals. But there's also here, interestingly, the idea that the story has perhaps not blinded entirely, but made naive the actors in that story, right? Not just Thorin and the dwarves, though certainly Thorin and the dwarves, but all of Lake Town. The only people who seem exempt to it are the Master and Bilbo, right? It's just those two figures, and I find that really fascinating. Oh, and I guess also, as we'll see in just a moment, in fact, this is our next slide. Let's get to this, and we'll see the other person who doesn't really believe the prophecy that everything from this point on is going to be completely easy. This is a kind of an indefensible segue out. This is not really something that we do very often in Tolkien's work, but this is a real cutaway, right? This is a TV style cutaway to meanwhile in a different location. In the meanwhile, the wood elves had gone back up the forest river with their cargoes, and there was a great excitement in the king's palace. I have never heard what happened to the chief of the guards and the butler. Nothing, of course, was ever said about the keys or barrels while the dwarves stayed in Lake Town, and Bilbo was careful never to become invisible. Still, I dare say, more was guessed than was known, though doubtless Mr. Baggins remained a bit of a mystery. In any case, the king now knew the dwarves' errand, or thought he did, and he said to himself, "Very well, let's see. No treasure will come back through Mirkwood without my having something to say in the matter, but I expect this will all come to a bad end, and serve them right." He at any rate did not believe in dwarves fighting and killing dragons like Smaug, and he strongly suspected attempted burglary or something like it, which shows he was a wise elf, and wiser than the men of the town, though not quite right, as we shall see in the end. He sent out his spies about the shores of the lake and as far northward toward the mountain as they would go, and waited. Brian is saying here in the chat, proposed Lord of the Rings-like titles for The Hobbit, The Fellowship of the Dwarves, The Two Mountains, The Return of the King. Yes. So many of Tolkien's stories could be subtitled or just titled Return of the King. Hugh is saying here in the chat, the master may be a snaky SOB, but he's also a pragmatist. At little risk to Lake Town, the future could be very rosy if the dwarves are successful. There's really only one good path to take. I think you're completely right, Hugh. And that is, I think, the ultimate condemnation of the master by Professor Tolkien, right? The idea of a person in a position of authority exercising something so banal as pragmatism rather than principle is a real stain on the master's character. It's a really interesting piece of positioning. I don't think, in fact, that we have time to really get into this tonight, but I was thinking today, again, with reference to the movie, how interesting it is that in terms of our positioning of the master, he's much less presented as a counterpoint to Thorin as he is a counterpoint to the Great Goblin. That's where the echo is. That's where the symmetry is, right? Or even Thranduil, right? You could conceivably counterpoint the master with Thranduil, and we don't. Instead, he's made grotesque in a way that speaks to the pantomime of that second film, but doesn't, I think, really land what is rotten in the heart of Lake Town. More on that, perhaps, when we return. In fact, wow, I'm just master of the segue tonight because everything I bring up happens to be the content of the next slide. So either I'm really good at segues or I'm really bad at them, and I'm kind of jumping the gun on my own discussion here. But let's take a look at our last slide for this evening, and we're going to spend just a little bit of time here on the master himself. If I can switch out my focus here. There we go. Then, for the first time, the master was surprised and a little frightened, and he wondered if Thorin was, after all, really a descendant of the old kings. He'd never thought that the dwarves would actually dare to approach Smaug, but believed they were frauds who would sooner or later be discovered and turned out. He was wrong. Thorin, of course, was really the grandson of the king under the mountain, and there is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. But the master was not sorry at all to let them go. They were expensive to keep, and their arrival had turned things into a long holiday in which business was at a standstill. Let them go and bother Smaug and see how he welcomes them, he thought. Certainly, O Thorin, Thrain's son, Thor's son, was what he said. You must claim your own. The hour is at hand, spoken of old. What help we can offer shall be yours, and we trust to your gratitude when your kingdom is regained. So one day, although autumn was now getting far on and winds were cold and leaving was falling fast, 3 large boats left Lake Town, laden with rowers, dwarves, Mr. Baggins, and many provisions. Horses and ponies had been sent round by circuitous paths to meet them at their appointed landing place. The master and his councillors bade them farewell from the great steps of the town hall and went down to the lake. People sang on the quays and out of windows. The white oars dipped and splashed, and off they went, north up the lake on the last stage of their long journey. The only person thoroughly unhappy was Bilbo. This symmetry here in this very short chapter as we both begin and end with Bilbo's misery, with an extended miserable period between, in fairness. A flu would be a nasty thing to, or a cold, whatever it is that we're diagnosing Bilbo with, would be a nasty thing to endure under the best of circumstances, but on a what I can't help but think is a fairly rickety edifice above the cold waters of the Long Lake. Oh, all the more unpleasant. So here we really see what the master is feeling. Again, we dip into his POV. We get this very direct account. He had thought that they were simply frauds. He was being patient, right? Okay, productivity has slowed here in Lake Town, but at least everyone is fairly happy, and he's getting the reflected glory of that, right? As the leader of an ebullient people, of a buoyant and joyous people, he's presumably basking in the reflected adoration here, and eventually it will run out on its own, except Thorin really is the grandson of the king under the mountain. And he's a dwarf, and I love that last line in that first paragraph. There is no knowing what a dwarf will not dare and do for revenge or the recovery of his own. Even in that conceptual sketch of what a dwarf is, we're now unfolding this idea of revenge. This is not just a treasure hunt anymore. We're going out, well, not just to get back what is ours, but to cost Smaug something very dear of his own. And really what we're seeing here, as we're beginning to directly in this very last passage, and we'll do more of this, much more of this, of course, back in Esgaroth on the other side of the trip to the Lonely Mountain. But what we're really doing here is positioning the master as a counterpoint to the king. The king under the mountain, yes, but also kings in general. Even the name the master, right? implies a kind of dominion with no sense of service. And here we see him not leading, not acting in principle, but as Hugh points out, acting pragmatically, acting, reacting, exploiting. He's willing to kind of go along with the tide here, to borrow an appropriately aquatic metaphor, right? He will react to the tide, but he will not at any point exercise principle or leadership, and he will not, it seems to me, serve his community. He is in a fundamentally different relationship vis-a-vis, the people of Lake Town than any good king that we see in Tolkien's work with regard to their own community, right? You can imagine Aragorn behaving like this, right? Aragorn is a leader. He does not, hold his finger to the wind to see which way it is blowing. Instead, we're getting something here that is, Brian is jumping ahead here in a really beautiful way, because this was, in fact, Brian, you're borrowing my mastery of the segue here, because this was a question that I wanted to present to you all. Brian writes, any idea when the dragon sickness begins to affect Thorin? Is it when he enters Smaug's treasury, or does it touch him before that? Is this an appropriate inference that we can draw from this chapter? Is the sight of the Lonely Mountain, in fact, kind of kindling something in the hearts of the dwarves? Now, it is really, really easy, I think, to overstep ourselves in exactly the same way as it's really easy to overstep ourselves in The Lord of the Rings when we're talking about the influence and the capability of the ring. There is a sliding scale of what you think the ring can do and what the ring wants, how powerful it is, what exactly it is capable of, right? You can position yourself anywhere on that scale, but there is an extreme end of the scale where you think that the ring is directly responsible for lots of things in that book, things which seem to be, well outside of its direct power. And it's very easy in the pages of The Hobbit to kind of retroactively do that with the notion of dragon sickness, with the idea of this, the sickening of greed, the desire for everything, as I think, as Hugh points out here, as the desire for the Arkenstone grows, right? The Arkenstone used here symbolically, right, kind of metonymically, as a representative of all material desire, right? A really great choice by Jackson to make it like a symbol of rulership, because then it is more directly applicable. But that misses the point that the Arkenstone is just the prettiest gem. It is just the singular gem. It is just this. It is not a symbol exactly. Or how can I put this? It is not a symbol of anything other than what it is, which is wealth, it is treasure, it is beauty, right? It is something that they want very much to possess. Rachel's saying here in the chat, I always thought of dragon sickness not as being contagious by loculation, by location, I'm guessing, is that a mistake, but by desire for more. Yes, but there is this idea in the Legendarium, right? The reason that the dragon is attracted is that the hoard has been collected, right, in advance. There is an idea, I think, that we can argue, or at least that is an arguable perspective on dragon sickness. There is a quality of dragon sickness that, you're right, isn't quite like contagious, right? But is maybe not even anchored in proximity, but anchored in direct connection to. Let's put a pin in all of this, because I do think that we're going to be able to look more reasonably at this, both immediately before and then immediately after our kind of our primary encounter in the Lonely Mountain. But it is worth thinking about, right? That as we're thinking of this prophecy, particularly as the prophecy is presented to us as, the mountain turning gold and the gold flowing out through the long lake down to Esgaroth, that there is a great deal of greed in play here. And is that a consequence? Let me step back and reframe this still further. A, are the people of Esgaroth particularly greedy? Are the people of Lake Town particularly greedy? Are they particularly concerned with or preoccupied by the accumulation of wealth? Is that true simply of the master, or is this a general thing, right? It's not a coincidence that I said in last week's reading that Tolkien doesn't talk about economics, but we're talking about economics in Lake Town in a way that we never have before, and frankly never will again. He's concerned at lost productivity. That does not seem to be a terribly Tolkienian thing to even worry about, so it puts an unusual emphasis on the accumulation of wealth. Is Lake Town greedy? Is Lake Town kind of suffering from a contact high from the dragon sickness within Erebor, right? From the dragon sickness of Smaug, from the dragon sickness which afflicts Thorin and afflicted his father, his grandfather before him, right? To which dwarves are kind of predisposed anyway. it's possible. And it's certainly an interesting area of speculation in terms of the prophecy and the power of the prophecy to, as Andrea pointed out, suddenly elevate Thorin. That Thorin now just shows up. And I'm willing, of course, to credit this to the compositional history of the piece. I'm willing to think about Professor Tolkien finally figuring out who Thorin is, giving him his right name, giving him his real identity. And now he shows up on the page. But it could be something more complex than that. There could be something moving under the surface of the piece here. Yeah, as Hugh says, Lake Town remembers the past when they benefited greatly from trade with the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain. Absolutely, that is literally true. But how do we draw from that both the memory of this positive economic relationship and the anticipation of a future positive economic relationship? How do we match that with this symbolism of the gold flowing down, right? The lake itself. This, as Brian pointed out, I believe, that ambiguous imagery that we saw in the poem. There's a great deal of work to do here, I think, in terms of better understanding exactly how we pull all of this apart. And unfortunately, we are now at the end of our show for this evening because we have to adjourn. Maybe we'll talk a little more about this over in the Green Dragon. If you guys want to join me for the after show discussion in about 15 minutes over there on the Patreon page, that is going to do it, as I say, though. For let me show you my schedule here. Next week, we've got a couple of bangers coming up is what we've got. Next week, October 21st, chapter 11 on the doorstep, a really great chapter in which we're again going to be talking a lot about prophecy and about inference and about agency. This is really where we start to question how much control over their fate the dwarves and Bilbo really have, and the degree to which prophecy and free will are compatible or incompatible. We're going to be talking about that next week. And then October 28th, the return of Bilbo's luck, inside information as Bilbo finally descends into the Lonely Mountain and confronts Smaug. A really, really great reading. And I do think it's fair to say that I'm kind of confirming, I think, here by proxy, a bunch of emails that I've had over the course of the last few weeks. It's funny to see the people who really think this book comes alive with Beorn's house, and the people who think this book comes alive with Thranduil, right, or with the spiders, I guess, then with Thranduil, and then with Lake Town. Everyone, I think, is pretty much agreed by this point that the book is what it is going to be. That we have arrived at this process of transformation between, the trolls and the goblins, I guess, right, through to what awaits us in the Lonely Mountain. That transformation is now complete, and what awaits us is just a roller coaster ride through to the end of the book. I cannot wait to come back now, having established all of this work, having done the preparatory work, and left us with more questions and answers, many, many more questions and answers. I can't wait to come back to Esgaroth and get Tolkien's own kind of response to those questions, his own response to the status quo that he establishes, and then kind of cracks apart when we come back to Lake Town to see the consequences of the dwarves' actions inside the Lonely Mountain. That will be in just a couple weeks' time. So I hope you will be able to join me for that. As I say, you can support Shire Reckoning and all the work that I do here, as incomplete and ramshackle as it is oftentimes, by visiting patreon.com/nextword. Nextword is the podcast network that I run with my wonderful partner, Elizabeth. We produce a number of different shows. We have done a show about the entire filmography of Tom Cruise. We're 2/3 of the way through a show looking in great depth and detail at Richard Linklater's fantastic Before trilogy. And of course, it's home to Stars and Swords, my genre fiction podcast, where we just concluded one half of our horror unit looking at David Sodergren's dark Scottish folktale, The Har. We just finished that up last week. This week we are beginning a book that I just think is luminous. I am so struck by the line-by-line brilliance of the writing of The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson that it's going to be really interesting on Thursday evening to see how well I can talk about that book without just quoting the entire thing, because it's just spectacular. So that's Stars and Swords. And you can find all of those shows, links to all of that stuff, and a way of supporting us directly to keep this podcast machine going at patreon.com/nextword, where you can also get access to all of the many, many, many bonus episodes, including the after show for Shire Reckoning, Last Call at the Green Dragon. That is going to do it. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Hugh and Rachel and Brian and Andrea. And I think I got everyone, at least everyone who spoke in the chat. Thank you guys so much for being here this evening. I will talk to you all again next week. Until then, take care. Good night, all.